if you could start recording. Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of our Edibles in the Summer Garden series, Kitchen Gardens, presented by two of your finest Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners, Becky Hardwick and Carol Bragdon. A deep thank you to everyone joining us today. What a neat time in history where we can share information together live across the globe like this. Thank you for taking your time to learn and explore our natural world with us. On behalf of the K-State Research and Extension Shawnee County office, I would also like to extend gratitude to the air, the water, and the earth. Here in Shawnee County, we are on the ancestral lands of the Oceti, Sakawin, Osage, Shawnee, and Kanza people, to name just some. Today, we are neighbors with the indigenous Prairie Band Potawatomi and Sac and Fox nations. According to Lila June Johnson and her work at Stanford, the University of New Mexico, and the University of Alaska, indigenous land stewardship practices have been in place for tens of thousands of years. And it's just within a few generations that private land ownership in North America has 92% of land holdings in non-indigenous hands. Emily Dickinson said, "Dwell in possibility." And KSRE Shawnee County would like to be a part of the solutions towards a future in equitable land stewardship. K-State is an equal opportunity employer, and we welcome and value inclusivity in our programming. Throughout the presentation, if you could please keep your microphone muted and video cameras off. You can type your questions over in the chat box. Shawnee County's own KSRE horticulture agent, Ariel Whiteley-Knoll, will be moderating the questions there. Ariel, thank you so much for being here with us today. At the end of the webinar, we should have time to turn our mics and cameras back on and have a little Q&A. So without further ado, I will share my screen and turn it over to Becky Hardwick.
All right, thank you, Leslie. And I think we all should be just thrilled to be sharing the ongoing tradition of gardening we're growing our food with all of those tribes and all of our ancestors that have come before us. So today we're going to talk about growing a kitchen garden with vegetables and herbs. And I'm going to talk about the vegetable part of it and then turn it over to Carol to talk about growing herbs. So Leslie, advance, please. And you talked about this, the K-State's an equal opportunity, so we'll get right into the next one. All right, so why grow vegetables? Watching plants grow and knowing the veggies you have just gathered for the evening meal will be on the table within an hour or two of harvest can be a very satisfying experience. And of course, because they're fresh and they really taste good. It helps you make healthy choices for your diet, and it's a great way to teach kids about gardening and to encourage them to eat veggies. I actually started gardening when I was really, really little because I grew up on a farm in Idaho, and my mom always raised a huge garden. And so I would help her plant everything, and then I'd run out there every morning to see what had sprouted. Then later on, when it came to harvesting and that, I could take a paring knife and a salt shaker, and my dad and I'd go out and harvest raw vegetables, and we eat raw turnips, eat carrots, eat tomatoes, and everything. So this is in my blood. Oh, next slide. So we're talking about the traditional vegetable gardens, and again, this is what my mom raised. We generally think of them as large plots planted in long rows. It takes lots of water, and it requires lots of weeding and weeding and weeding. I also got to do a lot of that when I was growing up. And big harvest, again, coming from a farm family that didn't have a lot of money, we depended on that garden. And my mom canned and froze, and we stored stuff in a root cellar. and fed us virtually the whole winter long. So traditional vegetable gardens can be great, but for a lot of us that now live in town, they're just a bit much for us, and sometimes we don't even have the space for them. So we're going to talk a little more about a smaller version. Next slide. So how is a kitchen garden different from a traditional garden? They're typically smaller, they're tended more often, and tend to be located conveniently close to the house. All of these things can change because, we need the best location for them. But when you're thinking about developing a kitchen garden, think about how they are going to fit in with your landscape and where you can put them that, you can go out there and spend a few minutes or a few hours, but they don't have to be something huge, and you don't have to go out and spend tons of time weeding them. And primarily kitchen gardens are meant for fresh eating rather than for growing large amounts of food for canning and preserving. And so you're thinking, you can go out there and you can pick things for dinner, pick things for breakfast. So every place I've lived in, Pocatello, Boise, Seattle, and Topeka, I have made a kitchen garden. And one summer, many, many, many years ago, when I was going to school and working, I lived one whole summer eating out of my little kitchen garden, ramen noodles and things out of my kitchen garden. And that's what I survived on that whole summer. And I was skinny as a rail, so it was probably the best eating I ever had in my life. Next slide. All right, where to plant? Of course, we all know that light is the most important thing for gardens and for vegetables. So the gardens need at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun a day for growing fruiting vegetables such as tomatoes. You can get by with a little bit of less direct sun for root crops, and even less for leafy crops like lettuce and some of those colder crops. So you can grow them in pots, and they don't necessarily need all of that sun during the day. Again, convenience. Place your garden near your house and near a water source. You can easily run out and tend and harvest. Make it your special place, where you can enjoy spending time, maybe a cup of coffee or a glass of wine while you garden. Have friends over for dinner and invite them to harvest the stuff for their dinner salad. Or when you want to go out in your PJs to get some herbs for your breakfast omelet. So this is primarily what a kitchen garden is. It's something that you can de-stress in, you can really enjoy, you can make it as pretty as you want, you make it as big as you want, as small as you want, but they do tend to be much smaller than the traditional gardens. So bottom line is, if you do have to choose between a sunny spot or a close one, pick the sunny one because your vegetables will do so much better. All right, next slide. Now, again, this is sort of the difference between a traditional garden and a kitchen garden. You're going to, spend some time thinking about the design of your garden and how it's going to fit into and enhance your overall landscape design. There are hundreds and hundreds of pictures out on the internet if you Google pictures of kitchen gardens. And it just shows a wide variety of different kinds of gardens and different designs. If you have a rather formal landscape design, you can come up with something that fits in with that. Or if you have more of the cottage design, can be more casual and find something that goes along with that. But primarily you're going to use raised beds. You can go vertical, use container gardening or a combination of all of the above. But in the end, think about eye appeal. Even mix in some flowers with your greens. Next slide. All right, let's talk about then some of the different kinds of small space gardening for kitchen gardens. Raised beds, we think of, as being something we can contain. And so, raised beds often fit more into a landscape that may be a little bit more formal because you've got them sort of contained within the beds themselves. It's important that you not make these beds too big, because the idea is you should be able to reach into the center of the bed from any of the places around the bed. Now, I really like this raised bed that's showing in the picture, because you can sit on the edge of it and reach in. And so something like that would fit in almost any landscape. It's very convenient to work in. The access is very, very easy. So if you have, some physical conditions that limit your ability to get up and down, this one would be a great one. So raised beds provide better drainage. There's less soil compaction because the soil is easier to amend in those smaller places. It provides for efficient watering and fertilizing, and the beds can be permanent or they can be moved. So, if you come up with a raised bed and you have it in an area and things just don't go well, or maybe it's not sunny enough, you can always take it apart and move it someplace else. Not often the easiest, because you got, the mix and everything in there, but you can do it. And then again, easier access because the beds are higher and the plants are easier to reach. Because of all of these things, you can produce 1.5 to 2 times more vegetables than in regular growing gardens in the ground. Nothing wrong with growing gardens in the ground, and kitchen gardens can, of course, be grown in the ground. But because you're getting them up and you've got a good soil mix in them, the accessibility and all of those kinds of things, the raised beds just seem to lend themselves to a smaller kitchen garden and work better. All right, next slide. So you can also consider going vertical. And I love this teepee. I hadn't even thought about that, using a teepee, but it works very, very well for going vertical. And so why do you want to go vertical? You can grow more food in less space. So vining crops take up less space. And one of the main things is protection from pests. It helps keep vegetables away from pests that live on the ground. Easier to harvest, brings crops to eye level and makes finding them easier. And I had to laugh when I was thinking about this, because who hasn't gone out one day and you're raising cucumbers, and particularly zucchini, and you go out there and here's these tiny little vegetables out there, and you think, aha, this is going to be wonderful. They'll be about the right size, in this many days. You get sidetracked, you go out there a few days later, and here are monsters lurking in the leaves. And so I think these vertical ideas help keep from getting overgrown vegetables like a zucchini seems to do, or a cucumber. I've done that and gone out there and had huge cucumbers that weren't worth eating. So easier to harvest. Cleaner, prettier vegetables because they're up and out of the dirt. So you don't have to spend as much time cleaning them off. And it's easier to get to the roots with water and fertilizer. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But it just gets them away from, your other crops that you're trying to raise, and helps keep them sort of contained with all of their vining and their little tendrils and everything. So it is easier. More sun exposure for those kinds of vegetables too. They're less likely to get shaded out by some of the other crops. So, okay, next slide, Leslie. Structures for vertical gardening, and they're almost endless. This picture on the right happens to be mine. And when I moved into my house here in Topeka, I have a garden shed in my backyard, and one side of it faces south. And so, like I told you, I have had a kitchen garden everywhere that I've lived. And so I thought, aha, perfect place. So I started out with just a raised bed, and it's kind of looking kind of shabby. I need to redo that a little bit. But then as I went along and I planted my tomato plants in there, and then I stuck in some cucumbers in the back, and this was without those lattice work panels. And of course, the cucumbers immediately started getting real chummy with the tomatoes and trying to strangle them. And so I went back to Lowe's and got these white vinyl lattice work panels and built a framework for them against the garden shed. And so now my cucumbers and my tomatoes or whatever else I stick in there can peacefully coexist without the cucumbers strangling them. And again, it does make it much, much easier to find the cucumbers and to water them and all of those kinds of things. So, you can use virtually any kind of structure to go vertical. You think of trellises that you can buy or build, arbors, a pergola, and the teepee. Some people use cages, built out of fencing or something like that. So, you can just be as creative as you want and let your imagination be your guide. I mean, I think a trellis or something like that, or an arbor with food plants rather than flowers growing up over it would be gorgeous and fun to have. I haven't tried that yet, but I may have to. So again, let your imagination be your guide on structuring some of these. So, all right, next slide. Let's talk a little bit about soil for raised beds. Soil for raised beds, any amended soil mix that includes good topsoil and organic matter. So very important that you don't use just regular soil because it doesn't drain well. So if you mix topsoil and organic matter in about equal amounts, it will drain well and it's easy to work in. Organic matter can be cotton burr compost, composted manure, if you make your own compost, sphagnum peat moss. So, looking at the picture over on the right shows some of those things, those materials and things that you can mix in with the soil. Now, when you're setting up a raised bed, you want to take out some of the soil, you'll take out some of the soil that's already in there and save that if you're going to make your own soil mix. And so shovel it out and save it. And then loosen the existing soil down at the bottom of where you have dug. And you want to spade or till it until it's about 6 to 8 inches deep. So it's very well loosened, particularly if you're in soil that has a lot of clay in it. Then take some of the amended soil mix, the dirt that you've taken out and mixed with the organic matter, and mix that into the top 2 or 3 inches of the bottom of your raised bed where you dug that out. And that helps alleviate the problems from having 2 different soil layers. And so then you would go ahead and fill the rest of the bed with the amended soil mix. And so the result will be, depending on how deep your raised beds are, will probably be 10 to 12 inches of really rich soil mix for your plants to grow in. My raised beds are not very big. Mine, like the one you saw, is 4 by 8, and I have another one that's about the same. And so I use bagged soil mix that I buy at the big box store. Each year I take some of the soil out of my raised beds and move it someplace else that I can use it. And then I add some bags of that garden soil in there. Now, the one thing that you want to be sure of if you're using the bagged soil, be sure you read the label, because you want to know what's in there. If you're making your soil mix at home between topsoil and organic matter, you don't have fertilizer added to it. But most of the bagged soil for raised beds has fertilizer in it. So again, make sure you read that label so you know what's in there and you don't over fertilize. All right, next slide. Watering raised beds, nothing rocket science or anything here, but water when the soil dries slightly, 1 or more inches per week is recommended. Drip irrigation is ideal. It uses less water, is more efficient, and places water at the root system. Also, because you're dealing with smaller spaces, it's easier to set up. So you can, sort of work with it and change it if you need to, but it really is ideal. You can also bury it, and so you're getting the water directly to the roots of the plants. I use hand watering in mine because, again, mine are small enough and I like to go out and play in the water and spend time out there. And so I hand water mine and water it gently and water it right at the base of the plant so it goes where it should go. If you use a sprinkler, be very, very careful. And I would kind of discourage it because constant wetting of vegetable plant foliage encourages disease problems. And here in Kansas, where we have, you know, a lot of rain, we have a lot high humidity. Last year, I had a real struggle with some of the mildew and things like that. And I ended up having to spray fungicide on some of my stuff. And I don't like to use a lot of spray. But last year, it just seemed like it was one of those years where, you know, I needed to use more of that and had more issues with it. So again, I would discourage using a sprinkler unless you're using a sprinkler down at the bottom and you just barely have it on, like when you're watering trees and you just have you know, a little pencil thin stream coming out of it and moving it around a lot. But again, drip irrigation is probably the ideal way to do it if you want to take the time to put that system together, or hand watering like I do. All right, next slide. Now, talking about fertilizing raised beds, and I touched on this because if you are using the soil mix that you have put together, compost and regular soil, topsoil, then you're going to need to put fertilizer on it. And so generally, if you're going to use that kind of mix, then you can use a general application of the 10-10-10 fertilizer, following the guidelines on the, you know, whatever you're using. Then you can also side dress the crops during the growing season based on the needs of those individual crops. Don't over fertilize, as this will lead to poor production. And again, if you use the bagged soil, really read the label so you know how much fertilizer is in it. All right, next slide. I got a little tickle in my throat. Container gardening is another way of growing a kitchen garden, or you know, growing some of your garden in containers. So you can locate them anywhere in your flower beds, on your deck, or any sunny location in your yard. You can group them together for, you know, eye appeal, or, you know, you can put them wherever you want to, use a variety of shapes and sizes. And I love this picture because that pot is beautiful and it's got all the salad greens and some herbs growing in it. So something like that, you know, on your deck or patio would be beautiful and as pretty as flowers. The other advantage of putting things in containers, of course, is that you can bring in tender plants during cold spells. And God only knows that in Kansas, blink your eyes and the weather changes. So, you know, we may have 80 degrees one day and we may have 40 degrees the next, as we have this spring. So that's one of the benefits of putting tender plants in containers, because you can move them around. And then one of the other benefits, of course, is you can use container gardens to control invasive plants like mint, so that they don't totally take over everything. They are kind of isolated by themselves and can do whatever they want. Next slide. So what vegetables are good for container gardening? You know, of course, we always think about tomatoes, and there have been so many different tomato varieties that have been developed for patio and you know, for containers and everything. So, you know, where we used to think of tomatoes just growing out somewhere in a garden, by now we're treating them almost as flowers that we grow on our decks and patios. Eggplant, and I like Japanese eggplant because it tends to be smaller, and I use it in Asian cooking. But I look at this picture, and who would not love walking out and seeing the sun hit those eggplants? I would grow them just for the color, just because they make me smile, they make me happy. But peppers, squash, leaf lettuce, green onions, radishes, herbs, all lend themselves to container gardening. Next slide. So what do we think about the pot size guidelines? And again, you can mix and match these and sort of like they have done here, lettuce in one, chard in another one, tomatoes in another one. So think about, you know, 1 gallon pot and smaller for small vegetables, a 1 to 3 gallon pot for larger vegetables like bush tomatoes and peppers, and then larger than a 3-gallon pot for full-size tomatoes and vine crops. Now, of course, you know, these bigger pots, we're not going to be able to move them around quite as freely as we are some of the other ones. So you'll take into consideration that too, if you know, are planting tender plants in those and need to move them, why you may not be able to do that. You may just have to cover them. But I think this is such a pretty combination of things that someone has growing out, looks like on their patio. So next slide. Let's talk a little bit about soil for the container vegetables. Now we talked about the soil for raised beds, and container vegetables are different because they need a soil mix that is well drained, well aerated, and has a pH that's close to neutral. So soil containing or soil less potting mixes, rather than, you know, like the bag garden soil or the soil that you mix on your own, offer all of these features. But again, if you buy potting mixes, be sure to read the label so you know what's in it, if it has fertilizer in it, you know, if it recommends it for vegetables or for, you know, other kinds of plants. So again, regular garden soil that you just go out and dig is not a good option for containers because it compacts, and container gardening particularly needs good drainage and airflow within the soil. So if you have a particularly large container, you might want to put some, you know, regular soil down in the bottom to fill it up a little bit. But the primary thing when you do that, you want to be very, very careful and make sure that you're getting good drainage in the portion that you fill, you know, with the potting mix, and that the water isn't going to puddle down there in the bottom and lead to, you know, the roots getting too much water, not enough oxygen, and all of those kinds of things. So just be aware of that if you do have a really large pot that you want to put soil, regular soil in the bottom. The potting mixes that you buy have all been treated during processing, so they're generally free of, you know, weed seeds, pests, and other disease. And so again, beware if you're using garden soil and mixing something in it to put in your pots, that it can contain some things that are detrimental to your vegetables, in addition to being not as good to drain and to get the airflow going. So it's better to probably buy the potting soil for container vegetables. Next slide. Watering container gardens, and again, this is not rocket science, because it's going to vary with the type of plant, the potting mix that you have in there, weather conditions, and actually the pot used, because some pots, you know, absorb a little bit more water, some don't. As with your flowers, your outdoor pots, you need to check them daily. And during our hot, dry spells, why they're going to need more water, you know, look at them and see if they're wilting. Stick your finger in them. We all do that. Stick your finger in an inch or so and see if it feels dry. And then don't overwater them. Apply a sufficient amount of water until a small amount comes out the bottom of the pot. It indicates that the soil is fully saturated and it don't add more. So it's better, you know, not to overwater them, again, because you might get root rot. So potting mixes can be easily washed out of your pots too. So be very, very gentle when you water them. If you're using a hose, you know, you don't want to turn the hose on and splash the soil all over. And so again, water them very, very gently. And I like to hand water mine. So, you know, I use a watering can in a lot of mine that are like that, so they don't come splashing out. All right, next one. Fertilizing container gardens. And again, this is one of those where if the potting mix, you know, that you use has some fertilizer in it, you want to know how long it's going to last and all that. But fertilizer, because you water them, you know, fairly often, and they're small, the fertilizer is washed out of the containers as you water. So a plant with, a smaller constricted root system requires regular feeding. I like to use the dilute, water solutions on mine. And if you do use that, apply, it's recommended at every other watering, or a lot of those now have instructions on them that tell you, what you're using it on. And so in this instance, use 1/4 the recommended rate unless the instructions give directions for continuous feeding for container gardening. So again, it's very important, like everything else, it's very important that when you're using fertilizers, anything, be sure you read the labels so you're not over fertilizing and killing your plants that way, or wondering why they don't do what you expect them to. And it could be because you're killing them with kindness. You can use the controlled release or time release fertilizers. They're designed to release fertilizer over a longer period of time. And if you prefer those, why, that's perfectly all right. I just prefer the dilute fertilizer solution because it's much easier to apply and control. Sorry, one of those crank calls. So just, you can choose whichever one you want, but make sure that you do read the instructions and follow them carefully. All right, next slide. Talking about the smaller gardens, whether it is in interplanting, probably is more in your raised beds, because interplanting involves planting a larger, slow growing vegetable and matching it with a faster, smaller vegetable. So by the time the big plants get grown up, you've already grown small plants in between them and harvest them before those big plants can shade them out. And an example of this is filling in between cauliflower with a quickly maturing vegetable such as lettuce or spinach. And then they can be harvested by the time that the big vegetables, get grown up. You can have had lots and lots of meals and salads and things like that out of it while those bigger ones are still growing. So interplanting is good. And again, it's something we can use primarily in those raised beds to make the most of the space that you have. All right, next slide. And succession planting is just kind of another take on that. It makes good use of space and timing. You can harvest vegetables all season long with some upfront planting. What they do is you seed them at intervals, and it depends on the seed and depends on the crop and everything. And so you can seed them to have one crop come on and then plant seeds. And so you've always got a continuous crop coming on. And you can use the same crop, or you can use different crops depending on what the harvest season is, depending on what the growing season is. The great resource of this is the K-State Vegetable Garden Planting Guide. And I looked at it and was thinking about putting a slide in on it, but it's just very, very difficult to read. So we've included the website there. And this vegetable planting guide is just a real short guide. I think it's just a few pages long, but it has some really great information in it. The one thing that I want to caution you about in both succession planting and interplanting is, in your planting process, do a little bit of research about the vegetables that you're planting, because some vegetables do not play well together. They practice social distancing for a reason. And an example of this is tomatoes don't like the cabbage family or potatoes, but they like carrots, basil, chives, and onions. But then if you plant onions and beans close together, the onions can cause the beans to be stunted. So it was really interesting to read about some of these. So again, when you're planting your garden, you may want to do a little bit of research on some of these. And if you're planning on using succession or interplanting, why, do a little research and see which of the vegetables do play well together and grow well together without doing, horrible things to each other. So potatoes in the nightshade group, they don't even sound friendly. but we love them anyway. All right, next slide. So vegetable climate preferences, again, in doing your planting and interplanting and putting them where you want, we think of the cool season vegetables as being lettuce, radishes, spinach, potatoes, onions, peas, carrots, cabbage, and asparagus. And, those are the ones that we can plant fairly early in the year here and can grow, both in raised beds and also in containers. Potatoes are a little bit of a stretch to grow in containers, but I've heard that there are some varieties now that they're developing for that of sweet potatoes and, put them in a large enough pot. The warm season crops we think of after the other ones have kind of gone their way: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, melons, sweet potatoes, pumpkin, squash, those beautiful eggplants, and beans. And so I hope this has been helpful, talking about the kitchen gardens. And again, kitchen gardens where we're so busy with so many things in our lives, it gives us an opportunity to still enjoy growing things and, going out and having a little bit of de-stressor by working with with plants and digging up into the dirt and, all of those. So I hope you try it, and I hope you have happy gardening. Now I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk about herbs for your kitchen garden.
Thanks, Becky. You've given us a great start to gardening in a smaller area for your kitchen garden. Next slide, please. So what is an herb? Herbs are plants that have usefulness, either in the past or present. We use them for flavoring, medicine, ornament, economic uses, industrial and cosmetic purposes. When we think of edible herbs, things that we want to grow in our kitchen garden, there's an acronym that kind of places it into the right perspective for the herbs, and that's GRAS, standing for generally recognized as safe status. If it's not an herb that has been recognized by the FDA for culinary use or has GRAS status, then it's better left for ornamental uses. Some herbs can be a bit dangerous if they're eaten in large quantities, and some really should just be left alone for ornamental uses. So when we think of gardening in our kitchen gardening herbs, we really want to use those that are safe for edible purposes. There's not a lot of solid research on herbs. Most of what we know about herbs has been handed down for generations. So we know some things, but it's not necessarily research-based, more lore of history. Next slide, please. How do you grow herbs? Well, very similar to the vegetables we talked about. Most herbs prefer sunlight, 6 to 8 hours a day. They like general garden soil. Most herbs do not like wet feet. They still like that good tilled organic matter that Becky talked about for preparing your vegetable garden, raised beds or pots, perfect for herbs. We don't want soil too fertile, so be careful and don't over fertilize things. Just your general mix is usually fine. What happens if you over fertilize those herbs is you'll get beautiful foliage, but they grow so fast they don't have time to develop the wonderful flavor that we really want out of the herbs. One comment I might add with growing herbs and vegetables in containers is to use fresh water. Do not use rain barrel or stored water when we're watering our containers, raised beds, because that can be contaminated. It's what comes down through the air, what lives on your roof and guttering. We probably don't want to drink. that kind of water, so we certainly don't want to add it to our fruits and vegetables and herbs. That could be, those things could be incorporated into those plants. So use fresh water, not rain barrel water. Use your rain barrel for watering your beautiful flowers. One of the good things about growing herbs is that there are few pests that bother them. Most of our herbs have quite fragrant smells to them, and the pests are deterred by that. So the herbs have a built-in protection system, if you will. Interestingly, though, some herbs are very particular to species of insects, such as swallowtail caterpillars thrive on dill, and aphids, spider mites, grasshoppers, and rust occasionally will attack some of our herbs, but by and large, they are pretty free of pests. So they're easy to have, and they don't bring problems into the other containers you may be growing the herbs with. Next slide, please. The edible garden, and this is something that I've really tried to do a little more in my own personal garden as well. When you look at the literature, you'll see things such as edible landscaping or foodscaping. And that is the concept of mixing edible foods, vegetables, and herbs into your landscape to grow food for your table. And Becky talked a little bit about this as well as we arrange things. But here you see some herbs right mixed in with some perennial flowers in my garden. And that is a marvelous way to blend things. There's no hard and fast rule that says the herb bed has to be separate and the vegetables have to be separate. You can intermix as space and how you might want some appearance. If you want something tall in the background, some tall okra has the most beautiful flowers and would cover up an ugly fence and yet still provide some vegetables for you, for example. Typically, edible gardens and foodscaping areas have come to evolve with smaller yards and condo living that is so common these days. It's easier to mix those kinds of things in than a full-size garden might be in our suburban type of areas. So choose some smaller varieties of vegetables and herbs. Becky referred to some of the container vegetables that are specifically grown for that, like some tomatoes and things that have been developed. And herbs are the same way. You might not want to plant huge fennel plants in your herb garden because they will take up 3 to 4 feet of space. And you could do a lot of other things as opposed to one very large plant. Many of our herbs grow exceptionally well in pots, and they'll grow in just general garden soil. There isn't anything that, other than for the most part, good drainage that you need. Remember, most herbs originated in the Mediterranean area where they have wind and some sandy soil and some rocks, and it may not all be just, the perfect garden. Most herbs will like the sun, and a few things do okay in the shady areas, but for the most part, you want a good sunny area for your herbs. Next slide, please. Start small in your little kitchen garden and your herb areas and add as you become experienced. Try different things. You may find that one really pleases you and the next one maybe not so much. Again, location, location, location. If it's easy to run out and grab some chives and thyme to mix in with your eggs in the morning, you'll do it. Or go grab some salad greens to mix in the evening. It's just a fabulous way. There's nothing better than fresh things as you're cooking. Just run out and take your scissors and go snip, snip, snip. Common herbs that people grow, the top 10 from the Herb Society of America are basil, thyme, bay leaf, sage, oregano, chives, dill, parsley, rosemary, and lavender. And most of these will grow quite well in our Kansas area. So you can have each of those. Some herbs are perennial. In other words, they come back every year, such as thyme, sage, oregano, chives, and lavender plants. Those are all perennial. Things that we have to plant each year include basil. It's much too tender. It would not last in cold weather at all. Bay leaf is a tropical tree, so if you want bay leaf, I would definitely say put it in a container and just let it summer on your patio and then take it inside. And then you can bring it back out the next year. But it's a tropical tree. You really cannot plant it in the ground in Kansas. Dill and parsley will self-seed, so even though the plants will only live a year, with a little bit of luck, they'll seed enough that you'll have some more. They may not be in the place you want them, but they will self-seed as well. Rosemary is a bit fussy in Kansas. We really treat it as an annual plant. With southern exposure or protected area, it may survive, but my luck has been only about 1 in 5 years will I ever get a rosemary to go over. My ideal is to trim it down towards the end of the year, repot it in a pot that's not huge, and then bring it in and sit it in my kitchen window. And then I've got nice rosemary smell in the house, and when I want to make some stew or something, I just go clip, clip, clip right there at the window. Next slide, please. I'd like to just share a little bit of information about some of the common herbs that you might experience good luck growing. One of the most common herbs that people like to cook with is basil. Basil comes in there must be 100 varieties of basil. There are all kinds. It comes in different colors, different flavors. So sweet basil or Genovese basil, lemon basil, there's a purple basil. There are some very spicy basils like holy basil. That might be a bit strong for your taste. It's often used in Thai cooking and some of the Asian foods, Italian cooking, some Mexican cooking uses basil. So it's a very widespread use. It loves full sun, a good moist soil, so keep it watered. It does not like cold weather. So right now is too soon to put your basil out. This weather that's 40 degrees in the evenings will just stunt your basil plants and they won't do well. So wait until it's at least 50, 55 reliably at night before you put your basils out. They could be started in the house early or by plants and then set them out once the nighttime temperatures are warm. It's just a wonderful, wonderful plant. Pinch the leaves early on to promote nice thick plants. And you can use them for salads, eggs, making pesto, adding to cooked dishes like your spaghetti sauce. Some people use basil to make some perfumes and potpourris. A very, very versatile, and it's also very pretty. There are some tall columnar basils. There are round, short globe basils. So even it comes in different sizes and shapes as well as flavors. Great herb to start with, easy to grow. And if you just picked one, that would be a good one to start with. Next slide, please. Chives. Chives are my other very favorite herb to recommend to people to start with. Chives are in the allium or onion family, and there are a number of different varieties of onions, of chives. The plain ones that are featured here in the picture, the onion chives that have the nice little purple flower, you can start those from seed. You can get a start from a neighbor or friend, and they will grow very readily in common areas, and they'll even tolerate a little bit of shade. They can expand, so put them in an area that you don't mind the clumps growing a bit. I would caution you if you want to grow garlic chives. Garlic chives have a broader leaf than the onion chives do, and they can be extremely invasive. They're a larger plant. And in my early gardening days of growing herbs, I thought they had the most wonderful flavor because they do have some garlic hints to their taste. However, they became so invasive, they took over the whole space, and it took me 2 years to dig them out. So garlic chives are best left either in a pot or in an area you don't care how big and thick that they may grow. They're just not real friendly in a small garden area. Chives are very hardy. You can grow them in a pot in the house in the winter if you wish, but they do well in Kansas. Once the flowers are done, you can cut them off, and every 3-4 weeks, if you want or the chives to continue, just give them a haircut and they'll come back. So snip, 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 use them fresh. You can make some wonderful cooking oils and vinegars with the flowers just as they begin to open. Fresh flowers, add them into some oil and vinegar, let them seep for a couple of weeks, and you'll have a nice vinegar or oil to use in cooking as well. So a very versatile onion, mild onion flavor. So anywhere you'd use an onion, you can use your chives. Next slide. Cilantro. Oh, one of our favorite ones. Cilantro is well known for adding flavor to Mexican type foods. It has the characteristics of a tender annual, so we grow it each year in this area from seed. It looks a lot like parsley, and I think it's really hard to tell the difference. So I make sure I put a sign in my little garden spot where I throw the cilantro seed. Otherwise, I'm out there having to snip and taste to decide what is it really growing. This is a plant that does very well with succession planting, where you would plant some every 3 to 4 weeks, and then you can have it last during the year because it's a fairly short, and it'll bolt in the heat, get real tall, and not have that wonderful flavor as it matures. So succession plantings and harvest when it's about 6 to 8 inches. So it makes great pico de gallo. It's helpful in Chinese and Greek flavorings, any Mediterranean type dishes. Now, if you do let it go to seed and harvest the seed, then you have a different herb that we call coriander. So that is one of the common herbs that's used in making pickles. So if it's the seed, it's coriander. If it's the leaves, it's cilantro. Next slide. Dill. Dill is I think, a beautiful plant. It's in the Apiaceae family, and they look like little umbrellas. That's how you know that particular family of plants. Dill is an annual, really a biennial plant, because it will reseed itself readily. I have a ton of it that I have to pull up every year because it gets in my garden walkways and in places I don't want. So the wind and the birds help it go all kinds of places, but it smells so heavenly. It doesn't transplant well. It has a very long tap root, and it does not transplant well. So it's best to put it in an area where it can just seed and grow every year for you. You can use the dill for salads early on. And of course, if you plant some for you, you must plant some for the swallowtail butterflies. They will just eat it all up. It is one of their favorite foods. So I think every year you can just count on having wonderful swallowtails on your dill. So plant one for you and plant 3 for the pollinators, and have those wonderful caterpillars just enjoy your dill as well as you do. Next slide. Lavender. Oh, lavender, I think, is one of my most favorite herbs. Lavender also comes in many species and cultivars. Some are large, some are quite small. For the most part, they are tender perennials. In Kansas, they typically, most of the varieties will survive well, especially if you put a little bit of mulch around them in the winter. They're good for zones 6 for the most part. We can get by with most lavenders. Again, they originated in the Mediterranean area. They love full sun, and they do not like overly rich soils. They like it well drained, don't like their feet wet. You harvest the flower buds before they bloom. You can dry them, use them in cooking. Um, Certainly fragrances like making some potpourris, soaps, things like that. I have a recipe for a lavender shortbread cookie that is just to die for. So cooking. Also, there's a number of rubs that you can put together that that contain lavender in it as well. So it's a harvesting the buds before just before they fully open, and they dry easily, so they're very nice to preserve, as well as just a beautiful ornamental. It's one of those that just mixes in very well with your flower beds, and many people grow them just because of the beautiful flowers that they create. I planted some that have variegated foliage this year, so I'm anxious to see how those mature. I don't know that they're as hardy as some of the standard lavenders like Munstead, but they're certainly beautiful and will add to my flower herb mixed garden areas. So next slide, please. Oh, mint, our favorite plant to hate. We love mint. However, it can be quite invasive. So this is one that I think works best in a pot. So get a good sized pot. You can sink the pot even in the ground a few inches to contain the roots of the mint, because it can really just overwhelm you. It comes in very many flavors, so spearmint, peppermint, mojito flavor, chocolate, just any number of types of flavors, and it grows very well in Kansas. This is one herb that you can grow in a partly shady area. In fact, I would recommend it because it slows down its traveling a bit, and yet you still get nice mint in a partially shade area. So it's great to go just pinch a few leaves, drop it in your tea for a little flavoring, or make a little mint sauce. And mint does repel some pests. It has, that was really its origins of use for many, many, many years, was to repel pests and provide a nice fragrance before we had air fresheners. Next slide, please. Oregano, another herb that's very easy to grow either in the ground or in pots. Many varieties of oregano. There are variegated ones that make a beautiful ground cover and have different flavors. A very closely related plant, which is part of a similar family, is sweet marjoram. It's a little bit smaller plant and a little bit milder flavor. If oregano is a bit overwhelming for you, then try some sweet marjoram. It is a delightful herb, and I think we don't use it anywhere near enough. In Kansas, oreganos, the general speaking oreganos, are very hardy. So even though you'll find it oftentimes listed as an annual, in most herb gardens, oregano grows very freely and comes back every year. It does like full sun. It'll grow in those hot, dry areas that other things won't. It grows fast, so cut it frequently to keep it from overwhelming your garden. It has kind of a hot, peppery flavor and can be used in, certainly Italian, Greek, and Latin dishes, vegetables, herbs, meats, fish. It's a very versatile herb. Great one to have in your garden. Next slide, please. Parsley. Oh, who doesn't love a good parsley? There is flat leaf and curly leaf. Curly leaf is what I think of for plate decorations in restaurants when I was a kid. Every fancy meal had a curly leaf parsley on the side. For cooking, we really prefer the flat leaf or Italian parsley. It has better flavor. We treat as an annual here. Some people have luck having it come back every year, but I don't have good luck with it coming back every year in my garden, so I plant some new each year. It's a plant that you can easily grow on the windowsill in the winter. Cut your outside stems because it grows from the center out, and as long as you just pick the outside ones, you'll continue to have parsley for quite a while. It is another very versatile herb, and you can add it into just about every dishes except things that you want to be sweet. Next slide, please. Rosemary is another wonderful herb. Again, many varieties. Sometimes you can grow it over the winter and sometimes you can't, but bring it in if you wish to keep some in your kitchen over the summer. It likes sandy soil, so some cactus soil. If you're putting in it in a pot, add in a little bit of that sandy cactus soil and your rosemary will grow a little better. Harvest no more than about 20% of the plant at a time. If it gets away from you and it gets really hard and tall, they make great skewers for your barbecue. So it's a very versatile plant, again, in many, many, many dishes. It's one that you may want to just put the little stem in your soup or your stew or your soup and let it marinate and then pull it out because the stems can get a little woody. You might not want to chew on those. But if you strip the leaves and chop them, then it's a great blending herb. Next slide, please. Thyme. One of the resources that I read on thyme says if you don't know what herb to use thyme. It's a mild, very versatile herb, comes in many, many, many varieties. We see some common thyme growing here, and they're pink flowers, white flowers, red flowers. So it blooms early in the spring, a little bit like alyssum does. So it grows well around rock areas. It's low growing for the most part. Most varieties do well as like a ground cover for you or between and around stepping stones. It's perennial here. It likes sun for the most part, and just cut it off with your scissors because it grows low, and you can enhance many, many foods just with a little bit of time. Next slide, please. Harvesting herbs. Pick them early in the morning. That's when the flavors will be the strongest. You might want an open container or basket so that the airflow stays good. Cut what you'll use. The annual herbs cut to a few inches. The perennials no more than 25 to 50% of their height. Wash in cool water. Lay them out to dry on a paper towel. If you're harvesting large amounts, like a lot of basil to make pesto, then one of the spinners works really well to wash them and dry them off. Next slide, please. Here's an edible garden. You see the vegetable garden box, the little herb areas, and then going on into the perennial flowers. Questions that you might have? I might just, I believe there's another slide. Yes, questions. Do feel free to call us on the response line if you have questions about growing. And again, the Kansas Garden Guide has excellent references. We'll take a couple of questions if we have some that haven't been answered by our talks. Becky and I'll be happy to address any that you might have. And we could talk a little bit more another time about how to harvest and preserve them. We ran out of time today.
Well, thanks so much, Carol and Becky. Really great program. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat. So if anybody has a question, you're welcome to either unmute and ask it yourself or put it in the chat and we will get it answered.
While you're thinking of your questions, I might just say that put a plug in for our pollinators. I see the little Save the Bees sign up there that Kevin has posted, and herbs are just pollinator friendly. Most all, we talked about the dill, but really all of the herbs attract pollinators. If you let your basil go to bloom, you will be rewarded in the fall with many, many beautiful plants and flowers and pollinating insects that come by to visit, butterflies and all kinds of things. So those herbs really do add to our pollinator rich gardens. Another reason to mix them in with your vegetables and flowers.
Yes, and Kevin and I were having a discussion in the chat about that. You know, caterpillars are kind of greedy. So you plant what you want for the herbs and then multiply it a few times for them. But you're absolutely right. I love that you both touched on not necessarily just keeping a certain type of plant together. And we just see, you know, like Becky was talking about, companion planting isn't a research-based term, but you absolutely see that when you mix plants from different families and different types and different heights together, those pest and disease problems go way down because it confuses the pests. It makes it harder for the diseases to find those plants. So I'm so glad that you both were able to talk about that today.
If you want to see some herbs growing, I would ask you to stop by the vegetable garden. We have a demonstration garden at the Expo Center, and we are redoing our herb bed this year. So it's a little early to see a lot, but we will, as the summer grows on, we're hoping that you can see that. There's also a nice herb garden at Ward Mead Gardens that you can visit. So many herbs around. Thank you, everybody.
And I will just say there was one question that came in on the registration, Carol. If you just want to talk real quickly about how long and sort of how generally are you storing your herbs? I think dried herbs is a big question. How long are they really good before we need to pitch them?
Sure. I think every season it's best to refresh your supply because you're going to gradually lose things. Herbs can be air dried. You can tie them and hang them in the spare closet. I don't have any of those. Or a well-protected area. The wind blows too much in Kansas. Or use a dehydrator. And that is my choice of drying herbs, is the dehydrator. Ovens get too hot and microwaves cook them. So those are not good options for most places, but a dehydrator works really well because you can turn the temperature down far enough. And there are resources to tell you what temperature for which herbs and how many hours to dry them. It takes a long time. Makes your house smell wonderful. Store them when they're crumbly. You don't want them leathery. And then, 6 to 12 months is about as long as you can. Store them in airtight containers and put them in a cupboard outside of the heat and light if you're going to do that. Many herbs can be frozen. You can chop them up, put them in some ice cubes, and then just pull out your ice cubes and drop them in the soup or whatever you're flavoring, and that works well too. You can bag whole leaves and stems on some things and just pop them in the freezer and pull them out as well. Or make an oil paste where you take a little olive oil or canola oil, chop the herbs, and freeze them in containers. And that makes a great way to saute things, or even butters. I'll mix some rosemary and garlic and chives and some butter, and you can keep that in the freezer for quite a while as well. So many ways to preserve and use those herbs. One other reference I might just say is a tablespoon of fresh herb is equal to a teaspoon of dry, or a quarter teaspoon of the ground herbs. That's another common question that we get.
Lovely. And I was just taking a look. Thank you all for the questions you put in the registration. It looks like you guys answered them. Becky, one question for you was how to grow vegetables in pots. And I think you answered that just perfectly throughout your presentation. So
Good.
thank you, ladies, so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We do have another program next week at 2 o'clock. I'll be discussing vegetable pests and their control. So we hope you all can join us then. Thanks, guys.